I'm Jennifer Tuttle, and on behalf of the Maine Women Writers Collection and UNE, I would like to welcome all of you to the Donna M. Loring Lecture. This is our 5th annual Donna M. Loring Lecture, by the way. I really am grateful to all of you for coming, and I'm really grateful and honored to have Bunny McBride here with us today. So I wanted to just say a few introductory words before we launch into the main attraction. And I wanted to, first of all, recognize many people who have done so much to make this event possible today. The most important acknowledgement goes to the curator of the Maine Women Writers Collection, Kathleen Miller. I also want to thank Donna Gaspar Jarvis, Elaine Brulette, and Catherine Fisher. I want to thank all of the staff from media services here. And I want to thank John Cooper at the UNE bookstore for bringing copies of Bunny's books, which folks are welcome to purchase afterward, and she probably will have a few minutes to sign those for you if you want to do that, which I would strongly encourage. We're also grateful to our co-sponsors of this event, the Office of Multicultural Affairs and Diversity, the Department of English, and the Program in Women's and Gender Studies. Today's talk is part of the Diversity Lecture Series at UNE, which provides opportunities for critically examining issues of diversity, equity, and justice, and to promote a more diverse and culturally pluralistic community. Now, a few logistical issues. We understand that some of you will have to leave for 1 o'clock classes, so please don't worry about that. Just please be as quiet as you can when you get up. We still might be discussing things at that point. Please continue to help yourselves to lunch. Please remember to silence your cell phones and other electronic devices, please. Anyone who is here for the Diversity Leadership Certificate, please see Donna Gaspar Jarvis right there raising her hand, red sweater, afterward, and she will get your name. So before we begin, I want to say just a few words about the annual Donna M. Loring Lecture. As many of you know, Donna Loring, whom I'm about to introduce for you, we're very honored to have her with us today. She's a tribal member of the Penobscot Indian Nation, and she held the position of the nation's representative to the Maine State Legislature for 12 years. Among her many accomplishments in that capacity, and there were many, was her sponsorship of the act to require teaching of Maine Native American history in Maine schools, which since implementation has begun to address an urgent need in our education system and in our culture at large. Donna is the author of In the Shadow of the Eagle, a tribal representative in Maine, which was published by Tilbury House in 2008, which I strongly recommend. And she also recently earned a Deborah Morton Award in 2011, given by the UNE trustees to outstanding women who have achieved high distinction in their careers and public service and who are exceptional leaders in civic, cultural, or social causes. In 2009, Donna Loring deposited her personal, professional, and literary papers to UNE's Maine Women Writers Collection. It's a special library collection of rare and unique material related to Maine women, which is housed on the Portland campus of UNE. And Donna Loring's papers comprise the first collection given by a Native woman to the university. We're deeply honored to have it, not only because it's inherently special and valuable, but also because of all it allows us to do to support research and promote scholarship on Native issues, as well as to enrich educational opportunities for and about Indigenous peoples. We're really profoundly grateful to Donna for honoring us in this way. And the Donna M. Loring Lecture highlights it's one way that we honor her and thank her for that, and it highlights issues of concern to Native people in Maine and beyond. And it's again one of the ways that we hope to acknowledge Donna Loring for her generous gift. So now I would like to turn the podium over to her, and she will introduce Bunny McBride. So Donna Loring, please give her a round of applause. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for attending. I've known Bunny for, I don't know, 20, 30 years, something like that. But I was very, very honored that she accepted my invitation to speak at this lecture. She's done a lot of work with the Maine tribes, and particularly with the Aroostook, am I right, Aroostook band? In helping those tribes to get federal recognition. And she's highly respected in the Native communities, and you have to work years and years to get the kind of respect that Bunny and Harold have, and believe me, they've earned it. In 1999, I was the tribal representative in the Maine legislature, and gave a sentiment in Bunny's honor in the Maine state legislature, recognizing her work for Native women. And I just can't say enough about what Bunny's really done to bring out what Native people, Native women especially, have done. So anyway, I'll get to the bios. And a lot of times when I get introduced, I had one incident where I was introduced in, it was Bar Harbor actually, and the Native guys, I don't know if there's any, from the Western tribes introduced me, and I gave him a bio, and he just said, well, here's Donna Loring. So I ended up having to tell them about who I was myself. So I don't want to do that to Bunny. So, okay, Bunny, if I make a mistake, I'm sure you can correct me here. Bunny had earned a master's at Columbia University in anthropology. She's the author of Women of the Dawn, which got a Friends of American Writers Literary Award. She also authored Molly Spotted Elk, the Penobscot in Paris. Also, Our Lives in Our Hands, Micmac Indian Baskets. And then she's co-authored a number of textbooks. The National Audubon Society Field Guide to African Wildlife, Cultural Anthropology, The Human Challenge, and Evolution Prehistory, The Human Challenge, and then The Essence of Anthropology. It's an abridgment of the edition of Anthropology. It says here that it's forthcoming. I don't know if it's already been published. And she's done a lot of work with the Abbey Museum, with exhibits, and in much consultation with the tribes. And I have to, admire Bunny, because when she does an exhibit, she really does consult with community members. So it's really not just Bunny's idea of how things should work. And we see that very rarely in our communities, and we do appreciate that. The other thing, too, is, I just, of course, Harold, he's always writing me, telling me about what Bunny's up to, and, So just before this, I get an email from Harold, and the subject is McBride elected president of the Women's World Summit Foundation. That's a pretty big honor. He says there's a whole lot of stuff he's talking about here, but I'll get to the end here. He says the Women's World Summit Foundation is an international not-for-profit, non-governmental organization, enjoys a consultative status with several United Nations organizations, attends selected international conferences and events, and follows regular sessions of Human Rights Council and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This appointment is a 2-year appointment. And the other presidents have been from Canada, China, Sierra Leone, and the founding directors from Switzerland. So it's, it's a pretty prestigious honor for her. So congratulations, Bunny, for that. So without further ado, I guess, and the other thing too is, Bunny has done lots and lots of journals, and she's been to lots of countries, China, Africa, and has written many articles, hundreds of articles. So, the title here about life stories of women across cultures, she knows what she's talking about. Okay, Bunny McBride. Oh, I broke my leg last year, so it's going to be a little tough getting down here.
Okay. We'll wait. Okay, jump. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Don't go away.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. And now, Carl, am I on? I am on. I hear myself. Thank you, Donna. And there's nothing like having my husband feed her information. That was pretty good. That's what you call a biased introduction. I want to thank Donna and also Kathleen. Where are you, Kathleen? Kathleen Miller, who's been my main contact for this event and has really been wonderful at pulling everything together. And also Jennifer Tuttle, also at the Maine Women's Writers Collection. And I had the opportunity to speak for the collection a few years ago and was really excited to be invited back. Are you getting feedback? No. Okay. All right, so thank you, and thank you to my friends who've popped up here, including my family. That's why the audience is big. There's like dozens of them. So this is the title of my talk, Listening with 15 Hearts. And what you see here is a small sampling of women who I've interviewed over the years and written about over the last 4 decades. And 5 of them were interviewed posthumously through their papers, through articles about them, through other people who knew them. But all of the others I interviewed face-to-face, and in houses, in cafes, in huts, in desert tents, in forests, in boats, in blueberry fields in Maine and cloudberry fields in the Arctic, all different little niches in the world. Just to give you, this woman here, this is Barrett Siri. This man here in the black jacket and the black glasses, I should tell you, that's Todd Hoffman, a fabulous photographer. And some of these pictures he has taken because we've worked together over the years. So Barrett is a reindeer herder in the Arctic up in Norway. This is Binta Kinte. You might recognize the name Kinte. This is the woman who was Alex Haley's link back to his ancestor slave, Kunta Kinte, who was the basis for his best-selling book and then the miniseries on television. That's in Gambia in West Africa. This is Munira. This is a Bijago woman off the coast of Gambia. The Bijago live on an island that has the same name as they, kind of like the Penobscots and the Penobscot River. And they're known among anthropologists as one of the rare examples of a matriarchal society. This is Fatima. She's a Tuareg nomad from Mali on the edge of the Sahara. This is my grandmother. If you haven't interviewed your grandmothers, I heartily encourage all of you to do that. Christine Martin, a painter. And this is Jean Weltfish. She is by far the most difficult interviewee I ever had in my life. She was an anthropologist, and she is known for her work among the Pawnee. Her book, The Last Universe, is still considered the authoritative work on the Pawnee. And she was really a bold social activist, and she openly challenged racism, classism, sexism. And for all of her activism, she was called into for questioning with the U.S. House Committee on American Activities during the Red Scare in the early 1950s, and the trumped-up suspicions that swirled around her caused her to lose her job at Columbia University at the height of her career, and it was a decade before she was able to get another position. So really, without a doubt, though, she was the most irascible, difficult person I ever interviewed. And I interviewed her in 1980 when she was 78 years old. And you know how we old women get. But the injustices that had been done by her had really fueled her fury over those that had been suffered by others. So she did not have much tolerance for scholarship that wasn't helping to alleviate injustices. So when I, as a graduate student in anthropology, went to interview her for my thesis topic, which was subjectivity and objectivity in anthropology, well, she blurted out, I mean, she just started yelling at me, and she said, this topic bores me. And she said, as a matter of fact, there's a whole lot of fancy business going on in anthropology, and all of it bores me. In fact, it's stupid. And then, before I could even ask her a single question, she said to me, "My dear, how old are you?" And I said, 29? And she said, "Well then, you couldn't possibly have anything like a spectrum." Well, I was so insulted. I was kind of speechless for a second. And I thought, well, that's not true. I have a spectrum. I've lived 29 years. And I thought, okay, it's not as wide as Gene Weltfish's. But that's why I had contacted her. I was trying to grow mine. And so I wasn't going to give up. She was ready to end the interview. So I pressed on. And ultimately, really in exasperation, she started talking, really yelling. And this torrent of words that came at me, but this one clarion message came through. And this is what she said. She said, "The key problem for anthropologists to address is inequality." And that really hit me. I mean, that just stayed with me. As it turned out, this was the last interview she ever did. She died 3 months later. But that credo that she put in my head really stayed with me. And in the 33 years since I interviewed her, my spectrum has grown a bit, and I owe a lot of that to the women pictured here, as well as a lot of women who are held in photographs in my heart. And what all of these women have in common is really stunning perseverance in the face of hardship, just qualities that really have inspired me through the years. So with that in mind, I thought I'd put together a talk based on these women, reflecting on how their life stories have helped to shape my approach to anthropology and writing, and how they've impacted my priorities and my sense of purpose. You don't have to worry, I'm not going to talk about all of them and make you stay for an entire week, but I've selected 4 who are pretty representative of whose combined lives kind of represent the range of the women pictured here. So I'm going to tell you about a Micmac basket maker, a Penobscot Indian dancer, a prolific Euro-American author, and a Chinese human rights activist. First, just a little background to add to what Donna said. Actually, that made me think of one time I was introduced for a talk in Manhattan, Kansas, big talk in the library, and the person who introduced me got up and said her name, and then she said, "And our speaker is Bunny McBride, and she can probably tell you about herself better than I can." And that was it. So I had to do what you had to do. Anyway, I came to anthropology by way of writing, by essay writing and journalism, and that shift happened back in 1978. And that year I traveled with a group of 8 other journalists to China. And we were among the very first journalists to go to China, allowed into the country after Nixon's 1972 visit opened up relations with China after 25 years of adversarial separation. So we were there an entire month, and after we returned home, we all wrote, or some did broadcast work, and we shared our stuff with each other. And to my amazement, it was 9 different Chinas. And I was really baffled by this because, frankly, you know, the Chinese, particularly in that period, were everything was very organized, and we did nearly the same thing every day, all of us. And I thought, how did this happen? And of course, to some extent, you know, every journalist asks questions that shapes the result of what they, of their end product. But because we had done everything pretty much the same every day, the breadth of distinction between our work really took me by surprise. And I began to wonder how much of my vision was shaping my view, and how, you know, was I writing from kind of a prison of my own personal beliefs. And I was looking for a way to hold that in check and to broaden, to sort of learn to circumnavigate what I was writing about. And I thought that anthropology, cultural anthropology, would be a good way to do that. So I decided to go to grad school in anthropology, and hoping to get some new insights on subjectivity and objectivity, but also to grow my research methodologies. After finishing my MA, I moved to Hallowell, Maine, because my sister lived there. I always follow her, and then she moved somewhere else. And my plan was to use that old riverside town as a home base while continuing a career of writing, focusing on indigenous peoples. And I was especially interested in Africa, where I'd done a fair amount of writing already. But then I got sidetracked by an old friend who was working with the Association of Aroostook Indians, based up in Holton, Maine. And that organization served off-reservation Indians in the state. And my friend told me that the AAI needed an anthropologist to help undo an injustice. And that was that the Micmacs had been excluded from the landmark 1980 Maine Indian Settlement Act. And when my friend asked me this, I looked at her really surprised, and I said, well, I studied anthropology for perspective to my writing. I'm not a real anthropologist. And I said, but there's a real one coming from the Netherlands. And that was Harold Prince, who had become my friend during grad school and then later became my colleague and my husband. As it turned out, AAI hired both of us, and we signed on as co-directors of research and development. And we would commute 4 hours from where we were in Hallowell up to Holton, Maine, and spend 3 days there a week. And we, well, the conditions weren't great. We stayed overnight in the old schoolhouse. There was a night guard there, but he left every night at 10 because he said it was haunted. So we were in this rambling old schoolhouse by ourselves, and all we had was this little foam mattress like this big, and that's where we slept. We laid it on top of 2 desks and slept there. And I don't mean that we each had one. There was one, and so, I mean, really, we slept side by side. We spooned our way through the entire federal recognition effort is really what happened. And we took home $80 a week each, and the work was very difficult. It was politically tricky, but I tell you, it was absolutely fascinating, and the need was really evident, so it was meaningful from the get-go. Harold took the lead in political strategizing with legal services, working out a theoretical basis for the Micmac federal recognition effort, and really doing most of the deep historical research from, you know, the 1500s through the, like, say, early 1800s. And then I took the lead in writing grant proposals, in penning articles about Micmacs to bring them to public attention, and helping to establish a basket bank so that, to help facilitate the year-round sale of Micmac baskets at a fair price. And then it also fell to me to gather the oral histories and the genealogies. And so I interviewed the elders, and the goal was to, through the elders, reach back through time to the early 1800s and meet Harold coming in from the 1500s. Most of the elders I interviewed were women, and many of them were basket makers. Among them was this woman, Sarah Lund, and her life story was really a tough one. I mean, it had It had more twists and turns and sharp points than a porcupine weave basket. And for me, at that time when I interviewed her, I was just coming out of a especially difficult period in my own life. So because of my own struggles, I found myself listening to her, not just with anthropological ears looking for cultural patterns, but I was really listening with a human heart in search of perspective. I talked with Sarah in her kitchen, in her garden, or in the living room where she made her baskets. And Todd knows this because you've been there. Her home always, I mean, it just smelled delicious. There was something savory cooking on the stove. There was the smell of ash splints. Sarah was always cooking something, and yet and always working, but she always made food and fed us, and she always made time to talk. Her life, whoops, that's too soon. Her life began in 1927 on Eel River Bar Reserve, Micmac Reserve, that's up in New Brunswick. And her mom was a basket maker, and her dad was a trapper. And soon after Sarah came along, her dad built a camp across Gaspé Peninsula, on Gaspé Peninsula, across the bay there, and moved. He and his wife moved there with little Sarah. I asked Sarah what her earliest memory was, and wow, I mean, it hit me so hard. She said, "When I was a tiny girl, Mama was sick. She used to holler, 'Sarah, go get my pail,' and then she would vomit blood into it. When I was just 4.5, she died. At her funeral, I crawled into her casket. I'd always slept with her, and I thought it was a fancy bed. My father gave me the worst spanking of my life at that funeral." So she had a tough beginning. Then more loss came for her at age 7, and that's when her dad took her to the residential school at Wabanakis in Nova Scotia. And then he went off to live his life as a hunter and a trapper. Like other Indian children at this mission school, Sarah was punished if she spoke her native language. It was straps on the hand and to bed without dinner. And within a year, she'd lost her native tongue. In 1941, when Sarah was 14 and her dad became ill, and so she was taken out of the school to nurse him back to health. And once she'd done that, he went out again to make a living, and she then went to live with an Army widow and 7 children as the caretaker. And it was the first of many housekeeping and caretaking jobs that she would have in her lifetime. The following year, she worked for a wealthy couple who lived just 3 miles from her family's reserve, and really longing to be with her own people. Whenever she could, she would walk to the reservation and visit with people there. During one visit, she met this man, Abe Harkwell. He was a Micmac trapper who stayed there with his sister in between expeditions. Abe reminded Sarah of her father, and really drawn to the familiar, she married him a year later. She was 15, he was 33. The day after her 16th birthday, Sarah gave birth to a son, and 2 more children came in quick succession. Like a lot of Micmacs of the day, Sarah took, with their young children in tow, followed a migratory life of seasonal labor. Sarah described it like this. She said, from April till June, we'd be living on the reserve digging clams in Dalhousie. June, July, we'd make potato baskets, usually in Maine. In August, we raked blueberries in Maine, and during September and October, we worked the potato harvest there. If we found a good rent after the harvest, we'd stay until March. I tell you, as migrant laborers, they really knew about lousy housing. Leaky barns, rat-infested granaries, rundown shacks. But Sarah, just invincible, really. Sarah used to like to say, I can make a home anywhere out of anything. And she did that. She was a real adventurer, and she really loved, that was the time she loved, of traveling with Abe, with their kids in tow. He really was the true love of her life. But there was a fatal flaw to their relationship, and in her words, Abe's alcoholism was something awful. He used to beat me so bad and leave me for months at a time. I tried to work when he was gone, but I had 3 kids, and it was hard. So in 1949, Sarah did something she swore she would never do. She put her 2 boys in Wabanakis and put her daughter in the arms of a friend to be cared for, and then she left Abe. And in the years that followed, Sarah married 3 more times. In 1952, she wed a Norwegian sea captain who she met when his ship was docked at Dalhousie. They honeymooned in Tokyo. I'll never forget a journalist coming up and interviewing Sarah in her house tucked away in Fort Kent and just assumed she'd been there forever and had no idea that Sarah had traveled the world. Anyway, he bought a home in Limestone, Maine, where Sarah worked at the local taxi stand. And whenever possible, she would go meet him in the ports where he landed for a while. And in 1955, she went to meet him in San Francisco, and she had really happy news that she was carrying their child. And then she got home and miscarried. And then within weeks, she got the devastating news that her husband had lost his life when his ship blew up in an explosion. So again on her own, and then after a year on her own, she married a local fellow in Limestone. Well, that guy got her to sell her house. He spent all her money, and he abused her, and then she left him before their first anniversary. In 1957, she hired on as a housekeeper for a divorced farmer with 3 kids. He offered a home to her boys. So she accepted the job. She pulled her boys out of Wabanakis. And then neighbors began to talk about the arrangement. So the guy said, why don't we get married? And Sarah said, okay. And then she said to me, that was nothing but a marriage of convenience. We never even shared a bed. He seemed like a pretty clean living man, but 6 months into their marriage, it turned out that he was a heavy drinker. And he too began abusing her. But she ended up staying for 4 years until her oldest son ended up in a detention home. And then she pulled out of that situation again. And then she found peaceful shelter with an elderly couple. And she nursed them until they died, one by one. In 1963, Sarah's only 36 by now, and she was at the end of her rope. And she really hung there for quite some time. This is what she said. For nearly 6 years, I lived with Micmac friends and did almost nothing but drink and help them make baskets. Then I got fed up with myself. She took a job with a Maliseet fellow named Pearlie, and he hired her to look after his elderly parents at their home in Caribou. He lived with them. And after they died, in 1970, Pearlie said, couldn't you just stay on and take care of me? And he was in his 60s, and she thought, yes, she could do that. But she was at a real crossroads in her life. As she put it, I wish you could hear her voice. I was thinking, by the old gibbers, I have to turn my life around. And she decided to get really serious about basketry. And she said this about it. I figured I could make a decent living weaving baskets. All I needed was someone to help. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, up shows Abe. She had never stopped loving this guy, the man behind the alcohol. So they started over. They moved in together. They made beautiful baskets together. Both of them loved the work. And, you know, Sarah, whenever Sarah finished a basket, she would throw it across the room. And she said, you know, it wasn't to test the strength. It was to prove the strength. As if she was proving she could do something that would not break, that wouldn't fall apart. And after a while, she told me that Pearlie really missed company and her good cooking. And she and Abe decided they could use some help with the basket business. So Pearlie moved in with them, and they became a threesome. Oh, these are her boys. I'm sorry. I didn't show you that. That's Abe and Sarah making baskets. This is one of Todd's pictures. And here they are with Pearlie. Sometimes Sarah said, but far less often than in the past, Abe would go on a drunk, but he did not abuse her. He always came back. And they had Pearlie there, who was really a balancer for both of them. I think about Sarah, and the only thing to me more stunning than the hardships that she described were her resilience and the gratitude she expressed that the end of her life was better than the beginning and the middle. In the 1980s, her daughter, Mary Alexina, came looking for Sarah and Abe. She didn't expect anything from the parents who had really abandoned her. But a dozen years later, after Sarah died, this is what Mary wrote to me about that visit. My mother had changed. She was so warm-hearted, and being with her made me feel so good inside that I cried. She put her arms around me and she said, "I love you, girl. I am so sorry." Each morning, I watched birds flock to her for feeding, and at night we had long talks in her bedroom. Listening to her, I started to believe in angels. Saying goodnight, I would hug her and kiss her on her cheek. Before I left, she made me a basket while I watched, and she gave me a blanket that she made. I still have both, and sometimes I bring the blanket out to hug. To me, my mother had become a grand lady. So what is the measure of life? Is it the length of our troubles or the moments we transcend them with love? Our failings or our contributions? Looking at Sarah's life through a broad scope, really a whole series of distinct contributions come into view, in addition to all the people who she cared for and took care of in her lifetime. At a very crucial time, she helped keep the threatened art of Wabanaki basket making alive. She sold her wares through the Aroostook Micmac Basket Bank. She participated in the film and in the book, Our Lives in Our Hands, and she made a basket for the band's permanent museum quality collection, which they still have to this day. Moreover, more than that, Sarah shared her story and her detailed descriptions of how she and Abe, as well as her parents and grandparents, followed seasonal work back and forth across the Canadian-U.S. border. That information was absolutely crucial to establish Micmac residency in Maine through time, which was necessary for the federal recognition effort. And for me personally, Sarah's story really put my own troubles into perspective. It was not just that my challenges in life paled compared to hers. For me, her story, well, I mean, it was really a call to buck up, no matter what life throws at you, and to make sure that the end is better than the beginning. So when I feel off-center or unproductive or out of sorts in any way, I hear Sarah saying, "By the old gibbers, I've got to turn my life around." And for me professionally, piecing together the Micmac oral histories had a very significant impact on my writing. First of all, it drove home the point of writing not only in a way that serves scholarship, but also that has meaning to and is useful to the people about whom you're writing. Doing those oral histories set me on a course of working collaboratively, and they also shed light on the power of biography to reveal cultural patterns and to convey history in a compelling and widely accessible way. I worked with the Micmac band throughout the 1980s, but it wasn't full-time. I also taught. I also took pursued journalism assignments in various parts of the world. And one day in 1988, when my husband took me to the airport in Portland, and I was heading to Africa with Todd, and Harold said to me, "Why are you always going so far away when there's so much to write about right here?" And he handed me a newspaper clip about Molly Spotted Elk, a Penobscot Indian dancer. And it was this picture. And it was such a haunting, and can you guys see it all? Oh, that's a bummer. I'm just wondering. Am I going to wreck the sound, you guys? Well, okay. Crane your necks, because she's worth looking at. Anyway, it was such a haunting picture, and I carried it with me on that trip. And I really couldn't get Molly out of my mind. So when I came back, I couldn't contact her. She had died in 1977, but I got in touch with her youngest sister, Eunice Nelson Bauman, also an anthropologist, and she was living on the Penobscot Reservation. And I knew her through our work with the Micmacs, and after a long conversation with Eunice said to me, you need to get in touch with Molly's daughter, Jean, who lives in Tennessee. And so I did, and several people had approached Jean to write her mother's biography. And for a rather curious reason that's in the introduction of the book, she decided I was the person to do it. And after we spent an intense week together, she entrusted to me boxes of Molly's memorabilia, her correspondence, her photographs, her news clips, her personal diaries. Well, I opened those boxes, and they just opened a world to me. Molly's life began on Indian Island on the Penobscot Reservation in Old Town. She was the oldest of 8 kids, and she was expected to help take care of her siblings. She began dancing professionally as a teenager to do that. And then in the years that followed, her beauty, her talent, her incredible perseverance and determination, they afforded her a vast range of experience, from vaudeville to Wild West shows to chic New York nightclubs to starring in a now classic film, The Silent Enemy, about Ojibwa Indians surviving a starvation winter. And in 1931, Molly danced before royalty and heads of state in the Colonial Exposition in Paris. And she also performed in clubs throughout the city. And she loved performing for Parisians. She found them a much finer audience than Americans. They were much more interested in the traditional dances that she did. And she really decided to stay in Paris, but not only because of that, but because of that guy in the lower left-hand corner. And she fell into a passionate love affair with him. He was a journalist for Paris Soir, the main newspaper in Paris. And I have to say, among her papers were his love letters, and I feel like I want to make photocopies and distribute them to every man I know, because, reading those letters, they're exquisite, really, really special. They often wrote articles together, and sometimes he appeared on stage with her dressed in Indian garb, and he would play the drum while she danced. Also, he is the one who encouraged her. She had collected Indian legends as a child from old people on the reservation, and he encouraged her to put those all down to go into a book. In 1934, Jean and Molly had a child together, and 4 years later they married. They encouraged her keen intellectual capacities by sending her to a private school. At 12, she authored her first publication. By 18, she had penned several reviews for the New York Times Book Review. At 19, she met a kindred spirit, a poetic young man named Peter. He asked her on a date, and her parents dropped them off at the movies. When they came out of the movies, it was a lovely night. And Peter said, "It's so beautiful, let's walk home." It was a half a mile home. She had never walked a half a mile in her life. And anyway, she did. And she was just exhilarated by his innocent suggestion that they do that. And she told me by the time they were home, she was in love after she made that walk. They married, and while Peter always encouraged her to walk, sometimes he carried her, as you see here. But in other ways, she carried him. He, too, was a writer of poems and plays, but Henrietta banked success more swiftly than he did, and it was her work that paid the bills. She wrote stories and feature articles for numerous newspapers and magazines, and in 1935, when she was 23, her first book came out, followed by another the next year. Henrietta's ambition to do something meaningful with her life was enormous, perhaps to counter what she referred to as quote, the world's appraisal of me as a cripple. Asked if she would have been the same person without polio, she answered, how do I know? What I do know, this always gets to me. Sorry. What I do know is that when life has tossed you up, you are not complacent. You are impelled to find meaning and purpose and develop character. Her landmark novel, Let My People Go, really did bolster character and her sense of purpose. She spent 3 years writing this poignant portrayal of the anti-slavery movement, and she became deeply committed to what she learned through the endeavor. During that time, she told her diary, I take on myself like stigmata all the cruelties and persecution and hatred. To me, the only real beauty is in the fostering of each person's dignity, and everything else must be subservient to that. During her lifetime, Henrietta authored more than, this was Richard Wright's comment about her book. During her lifetime, she wrote more than 24 books. They were mostly historical novels. She became known for her wide humanitarian interests, which included spirited participation in civil rights movements, as well as the movements for rights of laborers, women, prisoners, Native Americans, not to mention animals. She felt a kinship with life, with all life, and she shaped her professional and personal priorities accordingly. She once said, I spoke for anyone who asked me within the field of minority rights. My question was always, you're for the rights of minorities? Okay, what time do you want me? I spoke for groups left, right, and center. She also wrote for minority publications, such as the Negro Quarterly, and joined numerous organizations committed to the disenfranchised. These included leftist groups such as the Artists' Front to Win the War, the National Council of Arts, Sciences, and Professions, and various groups pressing for decolonization. When World War II ended, Henrietta joined the Congress of American Women. She served as one of the group's 13 delegates to the 1945 World Peace Conference in France, sponsored by the Women's International Democratic Federation. 800 women from 32 countries attended the conference to consider post-war problems. These included food and housing shortage, orphan children, rehabilitation of the wounded, restoration of democracy, international relations, as well as the status of women. What did I find out when I was reading about this in Henrietta's papers? She traveled there with Jean Weltfish, my most difficult interviewer. And she wrote about it for Women's Day magazine. When I met Henrietta in 1974, she was 65. Peter had left her for a walking woman, and she was rebuilding her life in Boston. She had just become editor of the art and literary page of an international newspaper, the Christian Science Monitor, and she was in the throes of turning it on its ear. She sought out writers of conscience, and she transformed the pages into an interethnic, interclass dialogue. It became one of the most read and respected sections of the paper, a place where artists, poets, prisoners, a wide range of movers and shakers had a voice. Some of the best-known thinkers in the world appeared on her pages, but she also nurtured young, unknown writers who yearned to make a difference, and that included writers like me. It's a little embarrassing to say this, but it was her hair that brought us together. Especially because of this morning. It was her hair that brought us this morning together. And it happened like this. I was directing a community center for low-income minority kids in Boston, and Henrietta, of course, was a donor for that. So she made a donation, and I wrote her a thank you, and then she called to thank me for my thank you. And then she asked me, did I know anybody who could come and cut and color and style her hair, because it was very difficult for her to go to salons to get there. And I said, I could do that, not knowing anything about it, but I thought I could do that. So I said I would, and well, who knew that opening a bottle of hair dye could really change your world? But it did. And So I went to her apartment, and her apartment was this tiny place, but it was so chock full of big ideas. It was floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a wide range of visitors who came, who were all drawn to the deep, meaningful kinds of conversation you had with Henrietta. I mean, Henrietta, she was like the best listener you could imagine. I mean, she understood listening, the real sine qua non of empathy. She had that in spades. She always wanted to hear the long version of any story that had meaning, and this included whatever I had to tell her about life at the community center, where these kids were wrestling with the opportunity as well as the violence of desegregation busing as they were being bused into white neighborhoods for school. At the time, I was taking a writing workshop with an Australian essayist, and I wrote some about these kids, and he suggested that I submit my essays to Henrietta's page, and I did on a whim, and really to my amazement, she accepted them, and we went on to become close friends. In 1978, I spent a year as her assistant editor, and she talked me into the job, saying I would be doing her such a favor, but as I got older, I realized it wasn't that at all. She was mentoring me, and she really helped in so many ways. She, among others, she helped me to hone editing skills, and she really encouraged a very light but effective touch that stayed true to each of the writers while bringing into sharper focus any examples of or insights on the human dignity theme that she felt was so essential. After a decade of friendship with her, I felt I knew her quite well. But after she died in 1984, I discovered how much I did not know. When I was researching Molly's story, I read widely about other dancers, famous dancers of the era, including Ruth St. Denis, the mother of modern dance. To my astonishment, when I read Ruth St. Denis's autobiography, what did I find but that Henrietta had ghostwritten it? I tell you, you saw me get a little choked up just now, that really choked me up, and for two reasons. First of all, the idea that my friend, who could barely walk, had been a conduit for a woman who moved with so much beauty and elegance on stages all around the world, I just found incredibly moving. But the second thing that brought tears to my eyes was because I had never asked the question that would have prompted Henrietta to tell me about this. For me, this was like an unforgettable lesson that the business of coming to know and understand one another, it is never finished. We must make a point of asking even when we think we know. There were many other discoveries for me to make about Henrietta because she left her papers to me, all of her personal correspondence, her diaries, her research files, her photographs, and I continue to find new words that speak to me that she has written. Among her papers, I found a 30-page transcript of her statement to the U.S. House Committee on Un-American Activities. Like Jean Weltfish, she had been accused of affiliating with groups that the government labeled as Communist Front organizations. The Congress of American Women, the Artist Front, the Negro Quarterly. And like Jean Weltfish, her professional life had suffered for years as a result. In her statement, Henrietta explained that her involvement with these groups, she explained her involvement with these groups like this. The basis for my activities has always been humane, never political. And then she offered a writer's perspective. I think a writer stands very close to life, and that her identification with men and women of all races, classes, and creeds is indissoluble. The world is hers to see as clearly as possible. She cuts off her own hand if she separates herself from any human being in joy or in sorrow, in conflict or in success. I have this quote on my desk today. And now we move to the last woman. During that earlier mentioned trip to China with 8 other journalists in 1978, we spent several days in Beijing. And one afternoon, I noticed that there was only one hotel where foreigners could stay. And I noticed that all of the staff of the hotel were jammed into one little room. So I was curious, and I peeked in to see what was going on. And there was a fellow standing near the door, and he said, "English lessons." And there was a little black and white TV in the corner, and on that TV was a woman teaching with English with great gusto, and great joy, and enunciating words with very careful clarity, and then, just flashing a very encouraging smile. And 25 years after that, I was in Geneva, Switzerland, to be interviewed as a possible board member for the Women's World Summit Foundation. And, as Donna said, the other women were on the board were from China, Switzerland, Sierra Leone, different parts of the world. And they were the kind of notable women that really made me wonder what I was doing in the room. And after they interviewed me, they asked me to step out in the hall so they could talk about me. And then 5 minutes later, they came out and they gave me a big hug and they said, "Welcome to the board." And I realized really the reason I got on that board is because I can write. I mean, if you want to have a place in the world, practice your writing, because everybody needs a writer. And they've really used me for that, and I've loved it. At dinner that night, I sat next to the board member from China, and hearing that she was an English professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University, on a whim I said, "You're not by any chance that woman I saw teaching Chinese on television back in 1978? And she sat up in her chair and she said, "Yes," she said, "I taught the country English." And I soon learned that this woman, Wu Qing, that teaching English was just the tip of her life. Her life began in 1932 in the arms of really remarkable parents who Qing likes to say met on a slow boat to America. It was in 1923. Her mom was 23 years old at the time, and she was heading to Wellesley College, where she would earn her master's degree in American literature. And her father, who was 22 at the time, was going to Dartmouth for his bachelor's degree and would go on to Columbia University to study with the famous Franz Boas and earn a PhD. He and Jean Weltfish, my most difficult interviewee, were classmates. Returning to China after their studies, Wu Qing's father, Wu Wenzhao, he founded the sociology and anthropology programs at Yanjing University in Beijing. Her mother, who was already an established writer, known by the pen name Bing Xin, which means I see heart, also taught there. She had published her first essay in 1919 as an undergraduate, inspired by her involvement in the May 4th student uprising against imperial rule. In the years that followed, Bing Xin emerged as one of China's most esteemed and most prolific 20th century writers. She wrote in the vernacular, broke new literary ground, and became known for her philosophy of love, perseverance, and integrity and optimism. She had one life motto, and it was very simple: love makes everything possible. That motto was put to the test often and personally. The Wu family survived years of China's political vicissitudes. They lived through the brutal Japanese occupation of China's coastal provinces during the Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 40. After the war, the family moved to Japan, where Qing's father had a diplomatic post. Qing was 12 at the time, and she protested vehemently, having to live with the enemy. She formed a little gang, she and a bunch of boys, but she was the leader. And they would all go out on their bicycles and find Japanese children to scare. And when her mom found out about that, she sat Qing down for a very serious talk. And she said, "How could you do that? You are spreading seeds of hatred. What have those children done to you? Their parents may have been killed because they protested the war." Qing said that was a turning point for her. It was the moment when she first learned to distinguish between people and governments. During their years in Japan, her mother cultivated friendships with Japanese women and was invited to teach Chinese literature at Tokyo University. She penned essays encouraging mothers around the world to forge friendships and thereby change the warring culture. She participated in the 1945 International Women's Conferences that Henrietta and Jean Weltfish attended, and I'm wondering, did they meet each other? I don't know. Reflecting on the lesson and life example that she received from her mother during her years in Japan, Ching told me, "It was my mother who taught me what it means to be human." She said this to me while we were sitting in a cafe in Geneva, and I was interviewing her about her family. And to illustrate her point, she said, she took my notepad and she drew this character. And she said, this is the character for human. It's Ren. And then she stood up in the middle of the restaurant, and which people don't really do in a nice restaurant in China. She stood up there, and all eyes turned to her, and she assumed the pose. And she said, This is Ren. This is human being. She said, it's 2 feet standing on the ground with the head tilting slightly to the left because that's where your heart is, and you have to listen to your heart. And then she said, and she added, she said, I think one leg stands for integrity and responsibility, and the other leg stands for learning and growing, and that is what it is to be human. A year after the 1949 Communist Revolution, the Wus came home from Japan, and by that time, Ching was 18 years old. So she focused on her studies. Her father had a university position, and her mother devoted herself to writing and to international exchange. As intellectuals who did not join the Communist Party, they suffered repeatedly under Mao's continuous revolution that was aimed at curbing revisionism. In 1956, for instance, there was the 100 Flowers campaign, which invited public debate and then turned on those who practiced it. So Ching's father was removed from his university position for the ideas that he put forth. And a decade later came the Cultural Revolution, when leaders, professors, diplomats were plucked from their jobs and sent to work on farms. By this time, Wu was also a professor, and she had married a colleague. So she and her parents all were sent out to work on these farms. And like her parents, she suffered public humiliation orchestrated by the Communist Party. So it was a rough time. At the end of the Cultural Revolution, Ching and her husband returned to their university jobs. And in 1984, Ching won an elected seat in the People's Congress of the Heijin district. That's Beijing's intellectual hub. There's like 3 million people and a dozen universities. The next year, she established the Women's Studies Forum, which was one of China's first non-government organizations. And she began traveling widely around China to promote gender awareness and women's empowerment. It was a life-changing year for her when she hit the rural areas, and she saw the plight of China's poor rural women, many of whom were illiterate and many of whom were put in forced marriages, which she equated to enslavement. Taking action, she established a training center for girls and for women in rural areas, a place where women can learn to be economically independent and also get some education. And she also helped initiate China's very first university course on feminism and began speaking widely on women's issues. In 1987, Ching became the first non-party member put forth for the larger Beijing Municipal People's Congress. That's when she got interested in the Chinese Constitution. She read it head to toe, looked at it in detail, and she concluded that it provided many more rights than people realized. And moreover, it included an explicit mandate that elected officials like herself were supposed to supervise the work of higher-up government officials. So she began asserting herself, insisting that China's laws be honored and not be casually ridden over by authorities. She still does. She carried copies of the Constitution with her everywhere she went. She had them in her shoulder bag. And when her constituents would complain to her and ask her to help them, she would say, read the Constitution and find out what your rights are in this area. Then you come back to me and we'll talk and we'll work on it together. She also took the unprecedented step of every Tuesday opening up her office for her constituents to come in and voice their complaints directly to her. And she was the one who said, listening is fundamental to democracy. You must listen with 15 hearts, especially to those who have different views. Ching's fearless frankness at home and abroad gets her into trouble. after speaking in Norway, for instance, about the need to activate the constitutional rights that are provided, human rights provided in China. She wasn't allowed to leave her country for 2 years. And in 2000, her outspokenness forced her retirement from her professorship. And in 2001, the Communist Party removed her name from the election ballots. But none of that has stopped her. She remains true to her mission, and she works across many fronts to, in her words, change the system from one governed by rule to one governed by, change the system from rule above man to rule of law. In measure, she feels protected by her very famous parents. And her mother's stories continue to reach, millions of Chinese children through the school curriculum year after year. But Ching says this about that. She says, "Some people use famous parents to make money. I use mine to take a stand for human rights in general and women's rights in particular." Wu Qing serves on several boards of non-government organizations around the world who are committed to the rights of women. And among those is the Women's World Summit Foundation that Donna mentioned in her introduction. And this foundation has been building a global network for empowering women and advancing the rights of women and children since 1991. And their initiatives include an annual prize for creativity in rural life. Every year it goes to 10 or 15 women from all corners of the world for their unique approaches to enhancing the economic, social, and political lives of women. With almost no resources and with little formal education and sometimes just stunning daring, these women reach out with solutions to shared problems, and their actions truly change the lives of their community. And every year I have the privilege of editing the profiles of the women who win this prize, and it never fails to inspire me. And now we're at the tail end here, and we come full circle back to Maine, and to Wabanaki basket makers, because in the year 2003, Teresa Secord, right here, who is the founder and the director of the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance, known as MEBA. She was a recipient of the Prize for Rural Creativity offered by the Women's World Summit Foundation. Teresa, it so happens, is Molly Spotted Elk's great niece. This photo shows her standing among another recipient right here, and the board members, Wu Qing, Philomena Steady, and the WWSF staff. Through the Basket Makers Alliance, the number of Wabanaki basket makers has grown from 55 founding members in '93 to more than 200 today. The average age has gone from the mid-60s down to age 40. MEBA is recognized as one of the foremost Native-run arts and cultural organizations in the entire country. MEBA members have won the major Native art prizes all across the country. I look at Teresa and I think of Sarah throwing her basket across the floor to prove that it wouldn't break. And they did not break. And remarkably, due to stunning determination and unbounded resilience, none of the women I've talked to you about today broke. Each of them, remarkably, when faced with adversity, they were galvanized rather than be paralyzed. And revisiting their lives is a really humbling experience for me, and it's a vivid reminder of very specific ways each of them has informed my life journey so far. And speaking of them feels like a clarion call to carry forward the insights and qualities of being that I've witnessed through them. Jean Weltfish, battling for equality. Sarah, deciding to rise above circumstances and turn her life around. Molly, reaching for realization. And Henrietta, calling forth and making room for the dignity of all. And Wu Qing, listening with 15 hearts. Thank you.
I know that some people have to go, and please, as I said before, it's perfectly all right. But anyone who wants to ask a question, we have a few minutes for a few questions. And I would just ask that if anyone wants to pose a question, would you please try to speak into this microphone here so that it gets onto the recording. So I'm going to let Bunny handle that whole process, but I will be happy to hand this to anyone who wants it.
I always have a question. Why is it that the Micmacs were left out of the land claim settlement?
Well, because nobody had done the ethno-historical research to demonstrate that they should have been included. And when in the end, when everybody thought it was going to be a big legal case and go to trial, because that, you may recall that the Maine Indian, some call it the land claims case, at that time, there was a possibility that the Wabanaki peoples had claim to like 2/3 of the state of Maine. So in the end, the state was eager to rush to a settlement. And so things began to happen very quickly, and there wasn't time to take care of the Micmacs. Yeah. Hi, John.
Come right back to you.
The Micmacs were considered migratory tribe, therefore they weren't. The Micmacs were considered a migratory tribe, and I think Bunny and Harold were able to demonstrate, I know they were able to demonstrate with some legal help that in fact was not the case, that they were a native Maine tribe and deserved recognition. And in those days, as Bunny pointed out, in the northern 2/3 of the state of Maine, you couldn't sell a property because you couldn't get clear title until the federal government decided to square up with the Micmacs, and when they did, that solved the issue.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome, Bunny.
Hi, I really liked what you said about working with the people who you're studying and learning more about and working with their families as you wrote the book. And I was just wondering, as you get more and more enmeshed in people's lives, how do you deal with, since people are complex, how do you deal with when somebody who you sort of admire so much does something that you don't like? I'm just asking, I'm a journalist too, and I sort of get enmeshed with my subject matter also, and I sometimes, because we're humans.
Yeah. Well, you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, I come from the position that we're all works in progress, and I think of that. So if I'm writing about a troubled person or a troubling person, and that story needs to be told, I'll tell that, but I'm also looking for why is it that way, and what's the context of it, and then what's the flip side of it. I mean, everybody has a flip side. Oh, I haven't found anybody who doesn't yet, but what do you do?
I try to probably do that, but not always successfully.
Don't quit.
We have time for two more, and I have one right here, so we'll get Sarah right after that.
Could you talk a little bit more? This is a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. About your next project or your next work.
I'm working on a book with my husband that takes place near here. It's about a little boy who disappears from Factory Island on Saco River in the 1830s and reappears 25 years later with his Penobscot wife and family. So who ends up being raised. It's a true story. So we're working on that. Yeah.
Hi, Bunny. Thank you so much. So interesting. I'm struck by your talk about collaboration and returning your writing about Molly to her daughter and to her sister. That is, I think, somewhat unusual in terms of anthropology perspective. I'm a researcher myself, and so I struggle with that a little bit, telling other people's stories and the ownership therein of the story. Is that kind of collaborative? Obviously, you know, in many cases, the stories you're telling are people who lived long ago, but is that something that you try to embed in your practice?
Yes. Yeah, and when the Micmac oral histories that I gathered have never been published. Everybody who offered them, I gave them transcripts of their oral histories, and then I asked them if they wanted to share their stories with each other, and they did. And so they all have a complete set. But they did say that I asked them if I could use those when I teach. I used to teach a course on indigenous peoples, and I thought it would be effective on the section about Micmacs if they could read the life stories of real people. And so the Micmacs, every one of them said, yes, you can. And so I shared them with my students, and it bowled me over how students responded to them. I mean, when they read the life stories, they wanted to know, how did the life get to be this way? What happened? What was the context for this? And issues of structural power and all kinds of anthropological, sociological issues came to the fore. And after they read the oral histories, the students made a list of questions they wanted to answer through this course about those lives. So again, not those stories, as I see it, belong to the community, and they're still in their hands. And maybe one day they'll come out. But anyway, as a modus operandi, I really feel, that saying, too many cooks spoil the pot. I don't really believe that. I think as long as everybody's committed to telling the story fully and truly, then I think you get a better result. Yeah.
I have one more last quick one,
Yeah.
and then we will wrap it up. Thank you.
Okay.
I mean it to be quick anyway. I'm not a researcher, but I'm really interested in the statement you made at the very beginning about early on, about how many Chinas had been seen, different 9 Chinas or something.
Yeah.
You spoke a little bit about trying to expand your own spectrum,
Yeah.
but how do you deal with or acknowledge, or have you gotten past that place where what you see is only what you can see? Does
yeah.
that make sense as a
It does
question?
make sense. I mean, it's an ongoing challenge, I think, and that idea of circumnavigating your subject. I mean, one thing that helps me to do that is to talk to other people and get their read on it. I do think that, we all bring a purpose to our work. And I mean, I have one driving question, and I've had it for a long time, and it's very basic. It's, how can we all fit together with grace? And I'm not talking just about human beings, I'm talking about all of life. So just like Henrietta, it was dignity. And for me, it's that idea of how can we fit. So I think it's valuable to have a driving question in your work, but then I'm just thinking how Todd could answer this question so well. How do you get, because he taught at SALT, Center for Documentary Field Studies, for years, and I remember in photography, you talking to students about subjectivity and objectivity and how really there is no real objectivity. But you have to make it work for you, and you have to challenge it by bringing in, I think, the views and insights of others to temper yourself. I mean, if you're aware of it, that helps a lot. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you,
You're the long
Bunny.
hitters. Thanks for staying.